Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial is woefully underrepresented within the housing sector. This series is around sharing a collective knowledge for the housing sector. You can find us either on our group page on LinkedIn or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host, Chris Kinnear, and today we are joined by two fantastic people. We are joined by Philippe Demougin from Bromford Flagship and Matthew Gardiner from the Disruptive Innovators Network. Thank you both so much for joining today.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
So the opening question, which we always ask everyone, is how were you involved in either housing and or geospatial?
Go on, Philippe.
Sure, happy to. So I work in social housing for Bromford Flagship as an innovation manager. So specifically, I focus on asset innovation and decarbonisation. My role is about looking at our housing stock and asking questions around how can we improve things looking forward. So that might be around damp and mold or energy efficiency or long-term net zero planning. So I bring together things like data, research, operational insights to help the organization move forward, both technologically and then also in terms of the processes we use. So I'm really interested in how homes really perform in the real world and then tuning our understanding to make better decisions in the future.
Oh, amazing. And Matthew, how about you?
Well, I guess I kind of straddle housing and geospatial. So I'm a geographer and have been for a very long time. It seemed to be the thing that at school I was both good at and interested in. At one stage, I even taught it. And so places and spaces have always been important for me. Places, spaces, and people. And that kind of spatial relationship that people have with the places that they live in brought me into housing. And I've been in housing since 1978. I had a 2-year break when I went to work in an investment bank, but broadly speaking, housing and geography have been my livelihood for 47 years.
That's incredible. So both of you have had really interesting and incredible backgrounds leading to what you're currently doing. Could you tell us a bit more about what led you, like your career today and what you're doing currently?
Yeah, sure. So I started off in research. So I did an undergrad in environmental science and then a postgrad in sustainable development. And then I moved more into business management, trying to understand essentially how businesses could behave more ethically. And I started teaching at Cardiff Uni. And I wrote some papers, and I really enjoyed academia, and I really enjoyed teaching, but I wanted to have more of an impact. And I felt like a lot of the papers I was writing wasn't really having a real world impact. And so I moved over into social housing into a role of research and innovation, and we set up a small team. And what I found there was just, in the nicest possible way, a host of problems that could require a bit of investigation and research and trialing new things. And yeah, then about 4 years ago, I moved over to Flagship, which has now merged with Bromford. And yeah, since then, obviously, as I mentioned, I've been engaged with things like asset management, sustainability, digital research. So I really like taking a step back and looking at the wider picture and asking the strategic questions of where's our sector moving towards, what technologies could we be adopting. We in my undergrad, we actually touched on GIS. I'm not an expert like Matthew, or certainly not like yourself, Chris. But I think there's certainly a lot to be learned there in terms of how social housing providers operate in space, obviously, and where our stock is located. And I think there's a lot there that we could move towards. So yeah, I like using evidence to predict where things are going and validate things, whether that's small scale pilots or just more process driven, like organizational improvements.
Mm-hmm.
So my career path has been slightly different, and completely accidental. I left university wanting to be a sports administrator, and they wouldn't have me. So my parents sent me an advert for a job at the Housing Corporation, and it was a trainee role, and I didn't really know what they did. The guy who interviewed me found out that my father was an accountant and said, "You don't want to join us, go and be an accountant like your dad." So there were some obstacles that were in the way before I actually got into social housing, but I kind of loved it when I got there. And in the time that I've worked in the sector, I've kind of I entered with idealism, so a geographer, a kind of a humanist, I suppose, and a believer that we're here now and can make a difference, and carried some of that idealism through my early work, which was policy related. I did a lot about getting single homeless people out of large hostels and out of psychiatric institutions around London. And then I had a kind of bit of my career when I climbed up the greasy pole of management, really, and lost all of my ideals, but learned an awful lot about about what the activities inside housing associations were. So I've done development work, I've done management work, I've done maintenance work, I've even raised private money, managed canteens, managed car parks. So a really varied career before I became a chief exec, which is, I think, one of the most privileged positions that you get to be in. Quite a bit of pressure, but a real privilege to be there. And then my last role after the place that I was at had kind of backed itself into a large London-based housing association under an acquisition. My last job was as head of ideation for that large London housing association, which was really to explore all the things that were likely to happen to the sector in the next 5 years. This was around 2018. And it was fascinating to really look closely at how adrift the sector was from technology and how the rate of change that there was in the external world around technology, and the rate of change internally to the sector just were completely out of kilter. And kind of I began to think about what it was that the sector was going to have to do in order to catch up. So when that role finished, I joined the Disruptive Innovators Network, and we do things to try and help organizations jump across the innovation chasm, the difficulty of moving things from ideas to small scale pilots and from pilots to larger universal activities.
I think one thing that I really resonate with what you were just saying, Matthew, and I've actually written that down as a kind of a note, is entered with idealism. I think that's a great line for working with social housing. And it's really interesting how you talk about the rate of change of technological development versus technological implementation. I think that's interesting. And you've just mentioned a bit about Din, and you've worked with him for several years now.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about you've told us a little bit about what Din is, but could you tell us a bit more about Din?
Yeah, so the Disruptive Innovators Network is a membership organisation for housing organisations, for social landlords. And what we try and do is to bring the outside in. So we go out and we look at the horizon and maybe sometimes even over the horizon. We're only a very small team of people, but we know people who are at the edges of things, and we bring them in to talk to the sector about how, the latest thinking in Silicon Valley is, or what a current futurist would imagine would be happening to housing in the next 10 years. We organise ourselves around 4 key work streams. One is around leadership and governance, and that's really, really quite important. But we have three others, one around property, one around data and digital, and one around people and culture. And actually those are the key blockages or enablers, depends which way you are looking at it, that seem to be operating in the social housing sector at the moment.
I really like that about it.
We've got about 80 members, no, well, a bit more than that, 90 members, but we're a very small team, the core team, and it's amazing the kind of visits that we have. Look on our website. If people aren't members already and they're in housing associations or local authorities, then we'd love to have you as members. Unfortunately, we don't have membership for people outside of that.
And one of the things that I really like about Dean is, as you say, you bring in people from all over to talk about ideas that aren't necessarily housing related, but actually their ideas can be applied to housing.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us on to our next question. Kind of the main reason why you're both on today is that you've both been working and developing an incredible bit of research looking into IoT. Could you tell us a bit more about the project and why it was chosen?
Do you want to start, Matthew? Because I think you were probably there initially at the beginning.
Yeah, well, okay. So it came from somebody asking why, or in this case, why not? So on one of those DIN trips to, in this case, I think it was Seattle rather than Silicon Valley, and it may or may not have been in a self-driving car. I don't know whether the story of it being in a self-driving car at the time is just a little bit of poetic license. But Dan Goodall from Bromford, who had come from a different sector completely, posed the question to Ian Wright, the CEO of Disruptive Innovators Network, why is the sector so far behind everyone else with IoT devices? And Ian said, I don't know. Why don't we have a look and try and find out? So its origination was kind of just a person asking why, somebody from outside the sector saying why. And, you know, I've always thought that there's the 5 levels of why, isn't it? You know, as a kid, I was horrible in the back seat of the car. You know, I'd always be saying why. So I always ask the why. But getting to the root cause of problems, asking 5 levels of why, you know, it's a bit tedious if you're a parent. It's a bit tedious if you're a manager of an upstart kind of underling, but actually you get to things, you reveal things, and so what we set out to do in the research was to reveal the answer to why has the sector been so slow in adopting IoT.
That's really interesting, and I haven't really thought about the question of why. I thought it would be like a productivity thing, but actually, yeah, why isn't it being used more? Philippe, is there anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I guess so. For me personally, that I obviously, when I first joined Bromford Flagship initially, I was working with a lot of IoT products, and I have over the years worked with IoT products, and I experienced a fair few barriers similar to what we then later discovered in the research firsthand. And despite there's just a huge promise, right, of IoT being able to deliver incredible things for us moving forward, you know, really visionary, whether that's, I mean, just the concept of, rather than someone going into your home with a clipboard once every 5 years and doing a stock survey, and then you feeding that one bit of data for each component onto a spreadsheet, you know, maybe linked to Power BI, so it's displaying somewhere, versus having a bit of kit, especially as these things scale and become cheaper, and can all connect to, say, a gateway, so like the brain inside the house, and send continuous data over so that it then links up to all the other data we have, and we know about the health of the home, whether that's damp and mold or certain components failing, the temperature, obviously things like energy use. And so I think that there's so much potential there in terms of a better service that we could be delivering to tenants, cost savings, because we know about problems earlier rather than waiting for things to fail. So kind of moving away from the break fix model more towards the predict prevent model, which probably, at least we imagine, could be a lot cheaper, and therefore save money, and just better information about what's going on in the home, and being able to diagnose things more effectively and more accurately. So despite that promise, 10 years on, really, from IoT really kind of launching into the sector, we don't seem to have really moved very far beyond trialing some pilots here and there. So I had that same question that Matthew's was referencing around, well, why is that? And obviously I had my own personal experiences, but I was really curious. And yeah, given my past experience with research, when the opportunity came up to do a real deep dive into a research topic that I thought was really interesting and could deliver real value, I jumped on it. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure working with Matthew over the last, well, now it's about 6 months intensively. Now we're kind of more at the back end, but yeah, we obviously then produced quite a long report and have been sort of presenting the findings and sharing the findings for the last couple of months.
So
yeah, and working with Philippe was a godsend, because there I was at DIN with the responsibility to do a piece of applied research without ever having done any applied research in my life, without knowing what was involved at all. And along comes Philippe. So I think that our skills were very complementary in terms of making this piece of work happen. I think there were a couple of other things from. Sorry, what was there was a personal itch to this for me. I have been involved. I've run an IT function. I've also been the chief exec in a place that made a complete technology cock up, I'd got there was a bit of unfinished business, I suppose, from my point of view. It was a personal quest to try and do something that gave a clear blueprint for people who wanted to take this forward, that would get them to a better place than the place that lots and lots of these pilots seem to have ended up in. We have a phrase in DIN called pilot purgatory. It's the place. These pilots aren't quite killed off. They're not kind of terminated. They're still kind of somehow just drifting along, but nobody's paying any attention to the data that's coming from them. Nobody's interested in making them whole or big again. They're just kind of blur. And we wanted to get past that blur and get it to something that was really beneficial for the supply chain, because they are interested in making money out of this, for the landlords because they have a desperate need to improve the quality of the responsiveness to the issues in the stock, and for tenants.
And sorry, Chris, I'm sure you're aware of time, but sorry, I just want to chime in one last thing, that just to build on what Matthew said, because I've been obviously working in the innovation space as kind of a doer for the last few years. And to me, what we discovered in this IoT research project was really symptomatic, and I imagine would be, again, so many of the learnings could be applied to GIS, for example, in terms of so many of the blockers we try to uncover. I think you could almost copy paste some of the findings into other similar types of research projects or pilots, as Matthew's alluding to, where, not to take away the punchline, but it's often about all the other things you're not thinking about implementing things properly, that could be applied to so many other innovation projects. Where so for me, often sort of being stuck in the weeds, not being able to see the forest for the trees, instead of sort of going an inch deep and a mile wide on 10 different projects, here was an opportunity to really dig a well and go, you know what, let's go a mile deep and see what is why, what is going on here, and then really figure that out. And then what's been interesting since then is I keep on, when you start, what's that saying? If you have a hammer in your hand, everything starts looking like a nail. But like now, since I've done this research project, I look at so many other projects and I'm seeing, you know what, that's really similar, or at least I can understand it from a different point of view because we have dug that deep into one project really extensively. Sorry, but to me, that's been really useful.
And there's loads of things that I completely agree with both of those. Matthew, from your point of pilots just end up into this area of purgatory where they're either just not continued or they just exist and nothing's done about it, which is just insane. And Philippe, definitely that kind of proactive, reactive, but also seeing the same systematic challenges in organizations. And this leads us to the big kind of question that I want to ask you. From reading the report, there are some amazing results that come out, some really interesting finds. Could you share with us like a quick overview of the results so we can all learn from your lessons?
Sure. Do you want me to kick it out? Should we just bounce it back and forth, Matthew?
Yeah. You kick this off, Philippe.
I'll kick it off, and just feel free to interrupt at any point. So what we found broadly is that there were some. So we started off with a literature review. So we examined the existing academic work, case studies, and then we spoke to loads of different people. So we had, I think, 39 in-depth interviews with, tenants and particularly landlords, the supply chain, what we called ecosystem enablers. We had tenant workshops, etc. So we really tried to sort of get a 360 view. And so obviously the findings did vary. It wasn't exactly the same in every organization. Not everyone told us exactly the same thing. But broadly, after coding all the data and sort of thematic mapping, etc., broadly what we found was it was rarely about the technology itself that didn't work. Broadly speaking, people did manage to install sensors. The sensors were feeding data, to say a platform that certain people within the housing association had access to. And broadly speaking, that data was more or less accurate. And broadly speaking, that could in theory be used effectively to improve things. But it's that last bit where it really got stuck. And so what we found is that it's all this other stuff around setting up these pilots or implementation plans that hadn't been thoroughly thought through. So one of the things, and it's not necessarily very sexy, but it's all that other stuff that you might necessarily not think about, or some of the bits you might have missed. So for example, do you have proper strategic buy-in from the top, as well as from sort of middle management and the operational teams, so that people at different levels really understand, why are we doing this? What are our long-term aims? If this does succeed, how are we going to start implementing it? To me, probably the most important one is operationally, how is this actually going to be implemented? So you're going to get access to all this data, and say it's damp and mold sensors. Okay, so you're going to get access to damp and mold sensors. Who is now going to see these alerts? How are you going to act on it? When are you going to act on it? Do you have budget to act on it? How is that process flow going to happen? Because just giving a team access to the data, that's not necessarily going to change things. Are they responsible for it now? Is that an additional responsibility? Do they need more training? Another big one was obviously data integration. So obviously a lot of this, what we can learn, I mean, the way I like to think about IoT data, it's like icing on the cake. You know, if you've got good housing data and good repair data and good asset data, and then you sprinkle the IoT data on top, brilliant operational insights. But if you don't exactly know, you know, I mean, sometimes which properties you own, let alone, you know, do they actually have a heat pump or not? Or, you know, is it really a solid wall or not? And are those different, you know, when was the last repair done? Those bits of data need to all speak to one another. When you've got a cake, then the icing is brilliant, kind of thing. Until then, it's not really that useful. You know, I'll stop there because I could probably go on. But Matthew, I'm sure you want to chime in.
Yeah, what do we find? Things to add to what Philippe has said. The kind of a little bit about what we found in relation to residents. There wasn't, from the data that we collected, there wasn't hostility towards the deployment of IoT devices. And you know, we're aware that some landlords deploy IoT devices kind of without consultation with residents or without engagement with residents because they say they can. That kind of thing caused the hostility. The not being mindful that this is my home that these sensors are going into, and you're affecting the way that my home is and what I see and so on. But generally speaking, people weren't particularly hostile to the idea of the sensor. So it was about the processes that were being used that very much needed to be rethought. And you know, landlords who kind of insist that we're going to do it face the problem that actually a tenant who doesn't want a sensor there will just take the sensor off the wall, or if it plugs in, unplug it and put it in a drawer. You know, there's little purpose to be served by forcing sensors onto a tenant who doesn't want it. And so one of our recommendations is that tenants have an opt-out ability on this kind of deployment. And our expectation is that once they see what the benefits are, actually they will probably opt back in, but that takes a little bit of time. I think I was surprised at how early stage the supply chain market was for this. You know, standardization is not a feature. There are old analog incumbents who are desperately trying to catch up with the digital age. There are startup digital disruptors who are trying to take on those Goliaths, and then there are the scale-ups in the middle. There are no standards. It's kind of just a bit. It's more Wild West than Westminster, I think, is kind of how I would describe it. It isn't. Well, is Westminster a smooth operating machine? I always imagine the civil service is a smooth operating machine, but maybe I'm not. You know, so something needs to be done in that market. And I think this wasn't so much a shock for me, but I think it, as our work carried on, it became more and more obvious to me that it was vitally important. You know, the digitization of data from homes doesn't appear in landlords' roadmaps. It's not on their strategic plans. It's not costed in their long-term financial plans. You know, it just does not feature at exec and board level as something that must be done. And I kind of understand that because it's not a regulatory requirement. And right now, the effort of the sector on meeting regulation is so all-consuming and even that meeting that regulatory obligation is a bit like playing whack-a-mole sometimes, that things which are outside the regulatory obligation are very difficult to contemplate. So we have this classic problem where IoT is an amazing solution to the problems that the sector has got, but the sector does not have the bandwidth to implement the IoT solutions. So it's stuck in a cycle that only very, very strong, concerted, long-term leadership can get it out of.
I think it was really amazing like three key things there. Philippe, I really liked your icing on the cake analogy. Like if you've got your lovely cake and the icing goes on top, it really supports everything that's going on. If you've just got like a bundled mess of ingredients and you try to put an icing over the top, it's not going to go down very well. The other thing that really got me was the human lack of human process for some landlords with their residents. That really surprised me when I read it because landlords are doing a big show on we listen to our residents, we care about our residents. And that seems to kind of contradict that kind of statement.
But some of that's about silos. So I did some tenant workshops, and they were organised by the housing landlords engagement teams, who were brilliant and really engaged, and the residents were really engaged with them. But if you talked about an IoT deployment which had taken place in that same landlord, that had been done by a completely different team to a completely different set of KPIs and performance statistics, which did not involve engagement.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I mean, that's fascinating.
So it's this it's the siloed nature of the service that is delivered, rather than the human-centered nature of that service delivery. So in an ideal world, everybody should have that engagement approach. But actually, in most landlords, because of the pressures that they're under, and this is hard stuff, the engagement is done by the engagement team, and the property team does the property stuff, and they have their own way of doing this, and they must do it.
I wonder if that's sorry, carry on, Philippe.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on that. Like, I think you're completely right, Chris. Like, in some sense, it's surprising, but to me, I think IoT it touches on so many different parts of the business, right? So it touches on clearly on IT and data and analytics. It touches on comms and customer engagement. Clearly, it touches on strategy and finance, but then it also touches on the operational side in terms of repairs, or acting on the data and middle management, etc. And so, if say an organization has got their customer engagement, so it's a well-oiled machine, they've got that really down. Where have they got it down? Well, probably in the areas that it's routine. We do routine repairs on bathrooms, and there's a process there, and we know how we gather feedback. When we communicate, we send a text, and then we send a message, and then we do this, and then we update, and that's been tried and tested. When you're adding IoT into it, there's all these things to think about, and they touch on so many different teams, and in large organizations, they're often quite siloed. And so, unfortunately, I don't think IoT is simply an innovation in terms of, it's not a simple innovation that you can sort of, you deploy it and then you forget about it. Like, I don't know, insulating someone's cavity wall. You go in, you insulate the cavity wall, you leave, you tell the tenant you've done it, and boom, it delivers. This is quite, it involves changing processes across the organization. So it's quite complicated. And I think, to go back to sort of a point from way back around disparaging around pilots that sort of get abandoned, I think often, someone have a bit of money, they say, oh, IoT sounds like a good idea, we'll try it, get a couple of people to sort of run that, they'll engage the various teams, but completely underestimate, if you actually want to get the benefits of this and scale this is a big undertaking, and it actually would involve a lot of different teams and actually changing things, not necessarily from one day to the next, but certainly over time. It would involve changing a lot of things, including how we engage with customers, and they would have to be engaged, at the start, at the middle, and at the end. And the point I always like to make, apart from giving them the option of opting out, is also what's in it for them. Like, make it really clear, look, we're going to do this, we're thinking of doing this, we think what we can do is deliver this better for you. Here's what's in it for you. And we'll keep you up to date on how we're doing with that. And then if we actually deliver it, you'll be able to see it and touch it and feel it and smell it and be like, wow, this is better, my home is less moldy or whatever, or we repaired your boiler before it broke or something.
Or we repaired the lift before it broke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
think
I
we're
think it's just delivering on promises. Oh, sorry.
I think we're encroaching very quickly into the next question, which is, you've listed some recommendations for kind of next steps for a bit of Bromford Flagship and the sector of a whole. And I think we're getting very close into that territory. Could you tell us a bit more about some of the recommendations you're making through the report?
Yeah, so I mean, just on the tenant bit, just to sort of close that one off, as we said, we would recommend having an opt-in, opt-out, and then engaging tenants early and keeping them engaged, letting them know what's in it for them, and then delivering on those promises. Then, yeah, I think getting proper buy-in early on from the various levels of the organization and the important teams that you'll need to include in there, and that will vary from depending on what type of IoT you're deploying, because we looked at all different types of IoT that could be deployed in homes. We did purposefully stay away from things that were too much around health and healthcare, because they're a bit more complicated and typically involve more personal data. That might be an interesting follow-up project, but we mostly kept it focused on the asset, although that does sometimes deliver some data related to the person, like humidity in the home will obviously indicate behavior sometimes, etc. Certainly thinking about the data infrastructure. So I think those would primarily be the bits sort of within the organization, but then there's stuff around the regulator standards, the market, the supply chain. But Matthew, maybe you, because I think you have a better understanding of those bits, maybe you want to take
over. So one of the things that still takes place is that there are products out there which capture the landlord's data and might provide the landlord with an opportunity to view that data through a kind of pinhole, but not able to use that data integrated back into their main systems, or if they are, it is only with the permission of the supplier rather than something that is guaranteed. So we recommend that landlords don't buy any of that kit anymore. I would strongly suggest to the supply chain that they don't make it anymore and that they operate open APIs and the data can firmly, happily move wherever it needs to go. But for the landlords, don't buy that stuff. And there's definitely something about the sector working with the supply chain to build a set of standards. We noted that there are other sectors where that has happened. Simple example now, if you have a modern car, you can pretty much take it to any garage and get the engine diagnosed, because one diagnostic machine deals with all types of cars because the components in the engine are standardized. We don't have that kind of standardization across the sector, and something that is worked on between the sector and the supply chain would be beneficial. And I think possibly, I don't know whether this is I don't know whether this is going to be taken up. I'd love it to be. I think it's one of the more controversial recommendations, but it is that the regulator consults on making it a regulatory obligation that landlords collect real-time data from their properties. We don't go into a great deal of detail about what real-time data is, what aspects it has to cover, but just the idea that in perhaps 10 years' time, just as housing associations had to meet the Decent Home Standard by 2010, announced in 2000, maybe we could have a 10-year window in which the regulator expects landlords to move towards collecting real-time data, because it is clear that real-time data will prevent some problems from arising because the data will show it before it shows us a problem, and it will mean that small problems don't turn into big problems, and that has to work to the financial benefit of the landlord and critically to the environmental health and living experience benefits for the residents. And I might go as far as to say that a regulator that in 10 years' time is still expecting regulatory standards to be met by a 5-yearly program of physical property inspection, I would say that regulator would not be fit for purpose. So I hope that the regulator picks up on that. I hope that the sector picks up on it. And I hope that the kind of carrot and stick of the benefits for residents, benefits financially for the landlord, and the stick of the regulator actually enable IoT deployment to accelerate over the next 10 years.
I really like that suggestion of changing the regulation around. You should be thinking, landlords should be thinking about collecting real-time data, because so many other sectors are collecting real-time data and using it appropriately. And if you can support your residents, absolutely. And I really like the fact that you're not descriptive in what you're saying they should be collecting. You're saying, have a think about this, have a decade, and yeah, I think that's really
good. And we're not even saying use IoT devices. You know, how that real-time data is collected at the moment, the fairly obvious thing would be IoT devices, I think, but who knows what's going to come, and other people may find different ways of doing it. So it's the real-time nature of the data, not the method of creating and transmitting that data, that we think the regulators should be interested in.
So the report is fantastic, and what I'll do is I'll put a link for it in the description and everything. This project is now completed, but I can really easily see there being a part 2 for this project. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, there's not a part 2. But if you did have a part 2 lined up, what do you think you'd do, or what do you think you'd change, or what else would you add into the remit?
I think we'd do slightly different things. My part 2 would definitely be to do what we've done for the physical asset for the human. So I would look at how IoT can change the nature of social care and the delivery of clinical care into residents' homes. We're already seeing that hospitals are realizing that moving people to hospital is a dangerous thing, that some people get ill from things when they're in hospital, and that causes significant life-changing events or even death, and that maintaining clinical service delivery within communities is the way in which they're starting to think about overcoming the cost of running those big district general hospitals, but also the risk to residents. And joining up social landlords with that emerging piece of health-related work would be my part 2. I think it'd be really difficult, because you are deep into kind of deeply personal data, but it might help the sector understand how GDPR really works, rather than having this worry that, we can't collect this, we'll do anything with it because it's GDPR. GDPR really matters. Don't break it, kids. But actually, it's not as restrictive as perhaps lots of people think it is.
Oh, that's a whole different podcast, I think, talking about GDPR.
Not one for me.
What do you think you would check? What would you do?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess to me would be now trying to apply it as best as possible. I'd love to see a world in which this moves forward, and to see some examples, maybe several. Maybe it becomes ubiquitous in the next 10 years. I mean, we all remember a time when smartphones weren't a thing, and now they're just completely ubiquitous. And it's changed our lives in so many different ways. Whether that's boarding passes for a plane, or QR codes, or whatever, banking, emails, it's changed the way in which we operate. Well, I could easily imagine a world in which better data, more integrated data, live data from our homes, changes the way in which social housing works in a quite a short amount of time. Certainly within 10 years, I could certainly see it becoming ubiquitous. But I think we probably need to go about it a little bit more intelligently, and a little bit more. I hope some of the findings we've pointed out in the report would point towards a productive way forward. I don't think our report is going to suddenly change the sector from one day to the next, certainly not. But hopefully it gets people thinking a bit and implementing these types of things. And as I said earlier, I think a lot of the findings we uncovered are applicable to the other parts of social housing as well. So yeah, that would be my wish to see this sort of implemented, and I'll certainly try to do my part at Bromford Flagship to do that. And by the way, I would also say, I don't think I think we try to be quite careful with this in the report. We're not saying you should rush into IoT. In fact, I think we're more saying the opposite. Like, lay the groundwork first. And if you're going to do it, then not necessarily go all in, but commit to a process with sort of checks and balances along the way to say, right, are we on track, or do we need to pivot and iterate and try this in a slightly different way? Maybe this type of technology is not working. Maybe we want to try something different. I think smart technology is not going anywhere. Like, it's only going to get better and only going to get more useful over time. Like, I think there's no way in which the future isn't including smart tech in our homes. Like, it's definitely coming. The question is, which device, which type of device, how, when, why, budgets, teams, all of that is, and those are the things we kind of try to uncover in the report. So I would just like us to move beyond these sort of isolated pilots that just start gathering dust and suck up our time and energy without really delivering what we're aiming to deliver, which is to improve the services for tenants and for better outcomes.
I think I really like the last part of don't rush into it, take your time, get your processes, get all your ducks in a row sort of thing. I think that's a really powerful statement. Now, obviously, this is a geospatial podcast. We want to talk about geospatial information. How do you think geospatial could support what you've been doing and what you've been looking at, and with IoT and smart devices and stuff?
There are lots and lots of ways from the big picture down to the micro. So one of the ways that some IoT devices communicate is via LoRaWAN. LoRaWAN networks don't have to be created by every landlord, where there are lots of landlords operating in a tight geography. So understanding the geography of the stock can make a LoRaWAN coverage for the whole of that stock cheaper to implement and easier to implement than if each individual housing association does it on their own. So the micro things that can save money, up to the macro, where actually, if we had got a proper 3D digital twin of the sector's estate, and it was collecting real-time data, we would begin to realize that some things happen in some geographies and some things don't happen in other geographies. And we would then ask the question, why is that? It wouldn't be about landlords, it would be about geographies. Is it about the orientation of the building? Is it about the side of the hill that the building is on? Is it about the nature of the tenancy? What is it that is making these properties do this and those properties do that? Those are fascinating questions that will help us to move the sector from that break fix, oh, it's happened, right, let's fix it, to the predict and prevent, because we will begin to get the data. So right across the spectrum, the more you get the geographical coverage of this activity and the sector's activity, the more insights will come out if I was an MP, I'd love to really get a picture about complaints across my constituency, not complaints by landlord. Yeah, so the spatial dimension is how people live their lives. They live in space. They don't live from the various suppliers who meet their needs within that space. And geospatial can help us live in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have that much else to add to that. I mean, the one thing I will add, Bromford Flagship is really looking at quite intensively at a place-based way of working. So in my personal view, I think it's really important, as a lot of us housing associations are getting bigger, that the steps between the operational teams, like say the housing teams, all the way up to the CEO, as the organization grows, that they could become further removed. And I think it's quite easy to move into a space where there's a lot of atomization. You know, there's 80,000 homes, you know, and it's difficult to actually get a feel for that. Whereas when we were smaller, you know, council estates, etc., and you know, everyone knew every road, that personal feel, I think, was a lot more there. So breaking up our stock into places, you know, say 500 homes, and having place-based teams which work with those, I think that could be quite a game changer. And overlaying that with IoT, I think, can probably provide a bit of a bridge there between, on the one hand, being able to get the benefits from the economies of scale with centralized services, right? You're not going to have, if we have 1,000 places within Bromford Flagship, we're not necessarily going to have, we're certainly not going to have, you know, 1,000 different HR teams or IT teams or, you know, finance teams. A lot of the things will be centralized. We'll have one dashboard that can maybe be broken down into 1,000 different places. But certainly the data could be applied both for the sort of the central hub as well as for the localized team to understand what's going on here. So I think I think it's really important that we have really strong bottom-up functionality through, you know, in our case, what we're calling place-based working. Now, I hope I haven't botched this, because this is really not my area of the business. One of my colleagues, Paul Taylor, is much more articulate about this. But yeah, that's how I would probably tie the two together, at least in my own personal view.
I think we've had Paul on previously on an episode.
Oh, great!
Okay. About doing it, and
listen
it was
to
a fantastic episode.
Yeah, listen to him. He'll have been much more articulate about that than I was, I'm sure.
Well, talking about bringing everything together and kind of creating centralized resources to support place-based working, we're moving on to the final question, and this is potentially becoming my favorite question because I'm getting brilliant responses from everyone. And it's, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you do with it? Who's going to go first on that big old question?
Go ahead, Matthew.
You want me to go? All right. So I've had an itch. I've had an itch for quite a long time, and that itch is that the social housing sector, on average, across the whole of the sector, provides the demonstrably best quality housing. It provides better quality housing than private rented, and interestingly, owner occupied, because there are a lot of owner occupiers who are house rich and money poor who've got houses in poor condition. So the quality of the sector's housing is good. The rents that we charge are lower than anybody else's, and the cost of renting is, generally speaking, lower than the cost of mortgaging. So it's the best quality at the lowest cost, with some of the most secure tenancy arrangements that you can possibly Imagine, you miss some rent payments. Well, you only have to repay rent at a small amount per week, and you stay in your property. You miss lots of mortgage payments, and life becomes potentially quite a lot more uncomfortable. So we've got this sector which has got the best quality houses at the lower cost, and it gives the most security of being where you are, and yet it's a sector that people want to get away from or don't choose to go to in the first place. So I do something to change that. With unlimited money, I would immediately cut rents by 50% for every existing resident. And I would then embark on a program of improvement to every single home that moved people from whatever bills they currently have for heating, lighting, hot water and cooking to zero bills. And indeed, in many cases, they might even be net positive, but zero bills and a 50% immediate reduction in rent. And that would then, I think, demonstrate the real value that social housing brings to people. Because I think it's a fantastic sector, but I think that somewhere along the line, we've kind of lost our reputation with the public. And so I think some bold steps to refresh that reputation are what's needed. Building lots of houses that then aren't particularly good on what people want, I don't think will do it.
I think that's a phenomenal idea. I love the idea of I think that the idea of a zero bill house. I mean, that's a great idea, isn't it?
And it's achievable.
Yeah, that's the thing. It is achievable.
Octopus are already looking at zero bills for a period of time.
Oh, I'm going to take that away, and that's going to be a great old thing to think about. How about you, Philippe? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I love Matthew's idea as well. I'd love to create little bubbles of innovation within communities, trying to create, I mean, I might call them well-being communities, trying to re-embed ourselves in community, in place, as we were talking about earlier, to create places where people want to live, where people can hopefully locally find jobs, get educated, have nice green spaces. It's funny, we did I can't remember where I read this. There was a survey done quite recently. I think it might have been in a London area where people appreciated the sound of trickling water near their place and how that improved well-being and the impact that had. Back in my academic days, we did a paper on blue spaces and green spaces, just being able to see green and blue spaces, how that impacted things. Sorry, Matthew, you wanted to...
Well, I was just going to make the joke that there's a sensor to pick up the sound of trickling water. If it's coming from your neighbour, that's not the trickling water you want.
Yeah. I mean, like a
stream.
A stream. Yeah, exactly. But also just a sense of ownership of this is our community. We have a say in what it looks like, what it feels like, what we want here. And yes, some things might still be standardized, and we might be able to sort of, again, going back to our place-based solution at Bromford Flagship, we might be able to copy-paste some bits where we go, you know what, this works really well here. Let's learn from what we've done here, and we'll try it somewhere. But we might be able to iterate and go, you know what, we want to try something slightly different in a different place. But yeah, I would really just heavily invest in community, in the quality of the homes, and try to reignite community. I just thinking about the good old days back in the day when people could play in the street, and I take our daughter to our local park here, and it's mostly empty, which is quite crazy thinking about how many kids live on the street. But it's back in, even when I was a kid, we were constantly in the park. So yeah, just seeing if we could invest in community and make it places people really want to live. So yeah, that would be what I would do if I had infinite money.
The line I've written it down of create places where people want to live. You know, you talk to certain social housing residents, and they're there because they feel they have to be there. That's where they've been put, rather than choosing to live in a brilliant community. And I think that's such a value and the way it should probably be going. And some of these people live and create their own communities. Like the Grenfell community was a fabulous community before the horrendous fire. And you hear a lot about in the past about these communities being all together and having street parties and everything else. And I don't really see that sort of stuff anymore. So I really like that concept. We have now reached the end of the podcast. It's both. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been really brilliant, and there's been some great insights. If anyone wishes to get in touch with you, what's probably the best way for them to do so?
I mean, for me, probably LinkedIn is probably the best. Just Philippe Demougin.
Yeah.
I'd be delighted for anybody to get in touch with me, and LinkedIn will probably work best. But after 47 years, I'm leaving the social housing stage at the end of this month. And I will be as interested in people making contact with me over LinkedIn around photography matters as I am around housing matters.
Oh, what I'll make sure I do is I'll put both your LinkedIn pages on the description when this goes out. And
Okay.
to those of you who've been listening, thank you so much for joining with us, and hope you've learned so much in all this as well. If you'd like to get involved in the podcast, please get in touch. Again, you can find us either on our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk or on our LinkedIn page. Matthew and Philippe, thank you so much for joining us once again. And to everyone who's listened, thank you and have a good day.
Thanks very much. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.